Today we'll be integrating Gemini into our own website. There are 3 core features that we will implement for Gemini to do for us, which is text-to-text generation, image and text-to-text generation, and also a little chat with Gemini. Let me show you how it works. The first functionality will be asking something from Gemini. You insert your prompt and then click submit. Once the request is processed, you get back your answer. The second one is where you provide an image and then ask a question about the image. Let's choose, for example, this thumbnail that we have and ask Gemini, what does this represent? And after a while, you get back your answer. As for the last one, this will be a little chat. Ask something from Gemini. He will answer, and then you can keep on chatting however long you want. We'll be building this with only HTML, CSS and JavaScript, so let's get started. Starting our project, we'll be needing 3 files, an index.html, which we'll be pretty much writing together, a styles.css, which is provided to you in the source code, and all of this is going to be provided to you in the source code, check down in the description, and then a text features JavaScript file, which we'll be writing together as well. But before we start with that, search up the Gemini docs. This will also be down in the description, because you'll be needing to get your API key. I won't be sharing mine, obviously. Keep your API keys a secret, don't push it to GitHub or don't send it to anyone else. But if you come to the API key section, you will be able to click this button and get yourself an API key. It's pretty straightforward, so I skip this step. I believe you'll be able to handle it. With that out of the way, let's start writing our HTML. Generate your basic boilerplate, link up your CSS, and then for starters, copy over the HTML that we have, the starting HTML, which is simply a container and an h1 tag. Just so we have something to see on our website, also go down to the description and get the source code for this one, copy this out, the prompt to text interaction, because that's what we'll be starting with. Now if you open up your app, this is something that you should be seeing. It's exactly the first part as I showed you. And now before your body tag ends, there are some scripts that we need to import. These are Gemini's scripts. The first one is going to be this map script. This is important that you copy exactly like this. It's from the Gemini documentation and its type is import map, which means the imports are mapped here, meaning if we are going to use the import syntax in our script, this is what it will be referring to, and it's important. And then below this script, we'll get our text features JavaScript or whatever JavaScript file you have, but it's also important that the type for this is going to be of type module. The reason is because only the module type lets you work with the import statements like Gemini in the documentation shows us. With that out of the way, we'll be using this simple Node.js import syntax. If you are not familiar with this, don't worry, just copy paste it out from the source code. This is the starting feature that we'll be looking at. We are importing Google Generative AI from @Google/Generative AI, and if you have a look in our HTML, that's exactly what we mapped out to where it should link to. And then there is an API key. I shut it off in region. Basically, it should be something like this. Obviously, I won't show mine. Get your own API key from Gemini. And then we also created, just like the documentation of Gemini shows you, a constant variable called GenAI, which is going to be a new instance of the Google Generative AI, and then pass in your API key. And next up, we've also created a model, which is GenAI.generative model, and basically you can use different models, but the recommended one is Gemini 1.5 Flash as of now, of course, because later on the documentation can change and the models will probably also change, but for the sake of this video we'll be using this model. And now we can move on to generating some text from our prompts. As I said, from our prompts, so the first variable that we'll be creating is going to be a constant variable called prompt. And then just hardcode something in here that you'd like to ask Gemini. For example, what is JavaScript? And then next we'll be having to connect to the model and ask the model to process our prompt. Since it's going to be a request, I'll be using the try-catch block. If you're not familiar with async operations, I've just released a video on it. It's explaining how to fetch and get data. But just quickly, the try-catch is what we'll try to execute. And if there is an error in that block, for example, the server is not available or we messed up a URL, then it will jump to the catch block and execute whatever is inside the catch block. I fill up the catch block first because that's the easiest one. Console.error, error generating and then we pass in the error. It's plain simple. If something went wrong, then we signal that something went wrong. And as for the try block, but we have to ask the model to generate some content for us. So model.generate content, and then call this function, make sure the spelling is the same, and then pass in a prompt. But this is going to be an async operation, meaning it will throw us back a response, which we have to await. And I don't want to move on with the code until we've awaited that response. And let's store this in a constant variable called result. And once we got back our response, I'll console.log out the result.response.text function, which means we'll be turning whatever is returned into plain text, plain string text that I can console log out. If you have a look at the console, it's filled up with text depending on what question you asked. Mine is pretty long because I asked what JavaScript is, and it gave me a pretty long answer. That's pretty good for starters. Now all we have to do is some HTML manipulation to make sure that the prompt that we type in from here gets submitted and then also gets displayed. Let's inspect our HTML first. We have a div with the ID text interaction. That's pretty basic. We have a form, and when we submit this form, we want to input whatever is in the text area to the model, and then the model can process whatever we have inserted into the text area, and then in the text response div, we can output the data that it throws us back, just like that JavaScript text would be. To work on that, I'll make some space, and then call the document.getElementById. I'm looking for the text form because it had the ID given. And then we are adding an event listener to it, and on submit, when the form is submitted, we'll pass in an async function. An async arrow function will be passed in, and this async arrow function will also receive the event object as E. And as most of you know, if you submit a form, the page will only refresh. So to prevent that from happening, I'll call e.preventDefault. Next, what we have left is to insert the prompt. But I don't want this prompt, I want the prompt to be extracted from the text area. So what I say is document.getElementById. We are looking for the text prompt, and for the text prompt, I'd like to get its value, what is currently inserted when the form is submitted. Next, I'll cut the try-catch block from here and paste it in under our code. But that's not enough because we are console logging. Instead of console logging, what I'd like to do is get the response div and then set its inner text. So document.getElementById text response, and then set the inner text value of that to be the result.response.text. By the way, the text function also returns a promise, so we might as well just wait for this as well. And now we can test this out. Let's ask Gemini for its favorite color. And after our form is submitted and the request is returned, we get back our answer. And it says as a large language model, it doesn't have a favorite color. But lucky for us, YouTube has some favorite channels, and if you'd like this video to reach others, maybe comment down below whatever you like, maybe your favorite color, or that you like this video very much. If you do, of course. Apparently, it helps the algorithm. Now with that little detour, I'd still like to change our code a little bit, because it's messy. If you look at this, you don't see much out of it, so I'll create a new function to encapsulate this code, a new async function, generate simple text. This is what I'll call it, and it will receive a prompt. I'll cut this try-catch block from there to here, cut the getElementById up into where it was, and then instead of setting the inner text of the value, I'll return the result.response.text. Otherwise, if you fail to generate, I'll return some string that it says failed to generate text. And now we can also remove the await keyword from here because we are returning a promise with this one, and instead create a variable in the event listener called response, and it will be equal to the generate simple text passed in with the prompt. Make sure to await this function, and then the response will be passed in for the inner text. Now our code is cleaner, and I am more happy about it. If I ask a question from Gemini, it will still work. So we only made our code a little prettier. I've cleaned up some of our code. These are regions in VS Code that you can open and close. This way our code is much cleaner. And let's inject further some more HTML so we can work on the image and text generation. I mean, you put in the image and then you get back some text. The image generation is unfortunately not yet public the SDK is not yet public. It's only for Python with some experimental features, as I recall. But if it's out, I'll make a video on that as well. In our HTML, paste in the elements from the source code, and we have some important stuff in here, especially at the input element. Because this input element is going to be for our files. The type is file, as you see it. It has an ID that's normal for an input element, but then it has something called except. That means what type of files are you able to choose? You are able to choose image format files. Image / and then an asterisk, meaning this is a wildcard. Any type of image like PNG, JPEG, WebP will be accepted, but only those. You cannot upload PDFs, doc files, I don't know, whatever the hell you can upload. All those will be excluded, only images. This time the code is going to be a little more complicated. This is because of the file upload and how the file upload works from the web. So I won't be console logging out things over here, we'll jump right onto manipulating the HTML. What I'll do now is call document.getElementById. We are looking for the image form, and the same as before, we are adding an event listener. We are passing in an async arrow function, and of course, don't forget that we are looking for the submit event over here. It receives the event object, so I'll call e.preventDefault to prevent the default reload behavior that submitting a form has. And then yet again, we'll create a constant variable called prompt. And this prompt is going to be equal to the document.getElementById. We're looking for the image prompt, and the image prompt's value is what we are interested in. We're also going to create another constant variable. This is going to be for our file that we upload. Image file is what I'll call it. And this will be the document.getElementById, and we're looking for the image prompt. And for that, we are also interested in its value. Next, I'll create another constant variable called image file. And this will be the document.getElementById, just like before. And we're looking for that input element where we upload the image, which will be image file. And we're looking for not the value, but the .files. And since the files is an array of files, meaning we have file 1, file 2, file 3 in an array, we are looking for the first file that was uploaded over there, which is the 0 indexed element. I leave a comment here that we should display the model response, and we'll create a separate function for doing that because I don't want to clean up the code like I did before. Let's just write it clean from the first step. And also before we do that, let's just grab the document.getElementById, and I'm looking for the image response and set the inner text to be, for example, an empty string, or something needs to come here, just so we know that we'll be needing to set this later. Now the next two functions is where things are going to get a little complicated. This won't be at first. Async function, I'll call this generate text with image. It will of course receive a prompt, and it will also receive an image file, the one that we get from the file selection tool. Inside that, create a try catch block. I already finished the catch block. You can copy paste this. We are handling the error. If there was an error, the console log an error out to the console, and we are also returning some text like we did before, fail to generate text, for example. And in here, we have to process the file and the prompt, of course. Now, the reason this is going to get a little complicated from now on is because when you are processing images, you have to convert them into something called a base64 format. Copy paste this in from our source code. This is going to be the const image part. And this object, whatever you have in here, is strictly needed to be like this. The data is going to be the base64 data, because that's the way it's processable for the API. And there's going to be a MIME type, which is the image file.type. And what is that? It's basically the image / and then asterisk, meaning it can be a PNG, a JPEG, or whatever type of image we've passed in or selected locally. And then comes the API call, which will be const result. And we have to await the API call, which will be the model.generate content, just like we did before, but this time we are not passing in a prompt, we are passing in an array in which the first element is going to be the prompt, and the second element is going to be the image part. This is, by the way, defined in the documentation of Gemini. So this is not something that I came up with on my own. This is what you read, how this data should look like in the Gemini documentation. And with this, now all we have to do is somehow get that base 64 data. Oh, and of course, before we do that, this function does nothing because it does not return anything. So I'd like to return the result.response.text as we did before. We are returning the promise that we can then await up here where we have to display the model response, but we'll do that later. Let's work on the base 64 now. For that, we'll be creating a helper function. It will be function file to base 64. It will of course receive the file that we'd like to convert. And this is going to return a new promise. Now, even in the async await video, I didn't go over creating new promises, so I'll explain over here. This is going to be a custom promise. What we've gone through there is that a promise gives back a response and it can either resolve or reject. So when you create a new promise, as a parameter, you pass in an arrow function with the resolve and the reject given as parameters. These resolve and reject are two functions that can be called, and whatever you put inside them as parameters will get thrown back as either a value or an error, accordingly of course. To read our data and then pass in something to this promise, we'll need a new constant variable called reader, and this will be a new file reader. This is a built-in API that you can use. This is something that we use to process files. And essentially what we want to do is call reader.read as data URL. And then pass in the file over here. This is the line that will process the file, but that's not enough for us because we want to return something when it already finished processing the file. Because this just says start processing the file, but it doesn't return us anything. It just does the operation and doesn't even signal back. Instead, what we do is the reader has two events, just like we would assign an event listener called onload. This is the first one, and it will be equal to an arrow function. And this arrow function is going to return the resolve. As I said, the resolve is yet again another function where if you pass in a value, then that value will get pushed back if the promise resolves successfully, and the same for the error, which we'll handle in a minute. It will throw back the error that you put in. Now, what value would I like to throw this back? This will be the reader.result.split, and we are splitting by a comma, and we are looking for the second element, which means the first indexed element. The reason we are doing this is because if you were to console log out the file that we have, it would have something like an images slash and what type of file, like PNG. It would have a prefix given to it, and that prefix is there to help the browser out what type of file got uploaded. But for most APIs, we don't need that. And with this, we remove that part of the file that got uploaded and then turn it into a pure base 64 data that can be passed into the API. Hope that's clear. If not, comment it down below and I'll provide more examples, explain, maybe even make a video about it if it's requested. Let's move on and handle the errors. On error, we are going to pass in an arrow function, and this is going to receive an error just like the catch block would, and we are going to call the reject function or return the reject promise with the error. With this, we are done with the helper function, and now we can use this and await this because it returns a promise to get back our data, which means the image base 64 is going to be file to base 64, and we are passing in the image file. And make sure to await this function. We don't want to move forward until we get this data back. With this, we get the base 64 data, get this into the processable data for the API, and then pass it in and then await the result. Now I'll replace this comment and I'll create a new constant variable. This will be const response is what I'll call it. This will be the await and then the generate text with image, the function that we've created down below. It will receive the prompt and the image file, and this function will throw us back a response with the text given back, so I can freely just replace the inner text with the response. Now with that, this should be working perfectly, so let's test it out and see if I've made any errors. Let's check the console first. It doesn't seem to have thrown us any errors so far. And maybe the CSS is a bit off over here, but it probably isn't the CSS, it's the fact that I copied this to the wrong place, I believe. Yes, if I cut this and put it back inside the container, this should be working. There we go. Now I've chosen an image, our React crash course, and then I'll ask what is on the picture, then hit generate, and it throws back what is on the image, and it truly is, because if you've seen the video then you know what I'm talking about. If not, don't worry, it doesn't matter. In the preview I showed you displaying the image, and we still need to work on that functionality, so we actually upload the image and also display that image. That is going to require another helper function with the base64, but now it's going to be far more understandable than before. To start with this, copy our base64 function and duplicate it. And instead of calling it to base64, this is going to be to base64 URL, because the difference is that here I do not want to remove these with splits, because to display the image we need the type and the prefix. So instead, I'll just simply put back the reader.result in here. The rest is going to stay the same. And now we only have to put an event listener to the onChange function for the file uploader, so it can process the image. Below our current implementation of the submit, I'll create a new event listener. Document.getElementById as usual. We are looking for the image file as the input that we'd like to add an event listener to. And we are looking for the change event. So whenever it changes, we'll yet again pass in an async arrow function. If we receive the event object, I'll call the const file, which is uploaded, will be the e.target.files. Zero indexed element. I've already explained this. This is an array of files, and the first one is what we're looking for because that's what got uploaded. And if the file is not null, that means something actually got uploaded, then const the image URL is going to be what we await from our helper function, which is the file to base64 URL, and then pass in the file, and then const image preview. This is going to be the div that I'd like to put our image in, or the image tag. Document.getElementById image preview, and I set the image preview.source to be the image URL. And since this is a hidden element by default, I'll also set the image preview.style.display to be block. With this, we should be able to see our image uploaded. Let's try this out again. Maybe the React crash course. Now it's displayed over there. And the actual functionality didn't change, but we can test it again. What could this represent? Submit it or hit generate. And then there is our prompt given back, or our response given back. We are almost done with the video. If you're enjoying so far and you found value, please consider subscribing or maybe just hitting the like button. We appreciate it. And as I said, it helps the algorithm. Next, we'll move on to the chat with the Gemini model. We'll be building an interactive chat as I showed you before. Let's jump back to our HTML. Here we'll create the HTML and the elements needed for our chatbot. Just feel free to copy this over from the source code. It's just basic HTML, not the main topic of the video. If you check it out, this is how it should be looking. You type in the message and then you can hit enter or the send button. And there we will dynamically embed some HTML elements so the text messages or the chat is displayed. To start chatting with Gemini, there is actually a chat session that we can start that's documented in the API. And to initialize a chat session, I'll create a constant variable called chat. We'll store the session in that, and we'll call model.startChat. This can receive an object. This object has some other values. For example, it has the history value, and this history value is going to be an array. What does this array contain? Well, it contains objects as of chats or the text that got inserted. For example, we have a role in this object, a role attribute, and it can be the user. And there are also parts of it, like parts. And this parts is going to be an array of objects in which there is a text, and this text like is going to be hello. This is what the user put in. Let's copy this, and now we can insert statically, for example, at the start, as I saw in the preview, that hello and great to meet you, what would you like to know is inserted by default. And only then do we start chatting. And this functionality is perfect for that, because then I can predefine some history with the bot. So instead of the role being the user as the second one, is going to be the model, and the parts is going to be, well, let me just copy this over. The part is going to be this, great to meet you, what would you like to know? So that's it for the chat initialization. We give in the history, inside that there are objects, and you tell which represents which, for example, the model or the user, and then inside the parts you further elaborate on what texts are displayed. And this is really great for us because we can then separate what the AI says and what the user says, and then style the elements accordingly. One last thing I'll do over here before we start working on the functions is going to be the chat history div. I'll grab this div with the document.getElementById, and we're looking for the chat history. Now let's create a function for displaying these messages. The reason I say create this function first is because we'll call two of these as to represent the first two messages, and then we'll move on to the dynamic rendering. So function display chat message. What should this function receive? This function should receive a role who's saying that message, and then a text as well. And in here, I'll create a constant variable. This will be the message element. This will be something that we dynamically create. This will be with the document.createElement. And then you pass in what type of element you'd like to create. Well, I'd like to create a div element. And depending on which role it is that's displaying the message, I'll append to the message element.classList a class with the add function that will, well, is going to be with the ternary operator. It will receive the role. And if the role is the user, then the syntax comes like this, a question mark. And what should we assign to it if it is a user? Well, the user message class. Otherwise, if it's not the user, meaning it's the model, the Gemini model that's putting in the message, then it's going to be the model message. I hope this makes sense. Basically, we are just assigning classes based on which role is texting. I could also do this with an if statement, but I believe this is cleaner. And then what we'll do is call the message element, because, okay, we've created the element, but we've not yet done anything with it. We'll set its inner text to be the text that's given. And that's not enough. As I said, we created the element, but we also need to display it. And to display it, I say chat history div. That's the reason we grabbed it. .append child, meaning we'll append an element dynamically, and we'll append the message element. With that, we are done with this functionality. So let's call the display chat message. I want one role for the user. I'd like him to say hello, and then also display chat message. I'd like the model to say, great to meet you, what would you like to know? There we go. And let's check on our app. As you can see, it's exactly as I showed you in the preview. These two are by default over there. Hello, great to meet you, what would you like to know? And if we come back, we are also, of course, explicitly saying that this should appear in the history of the chat. So with that, we are done with the static part. Now we can move on to the event listener and submit our form or our chat, so we can continuously chat with the AI. So below our chat initialization, create a new event listener document.getElementById. We are looking for the chat form, and we are looking to add an event listener to this for the submit event as usual. So submit, and this will receive yet again an async arrow function that receives the event object, because I'd like to prevent the default behavior when we submit the form. This is nothing new, you've already done this. And then the const user message, we will extract this from the chat input. So document.getElementById, chat input, whatever we inputted there, we're looking for its value. That's clear, basic HTML form handling. Nothing too crazy. And I'd also like to display the chat message now first. We are, of course, as the user, and the user message is what we are displaying. And also, just to make this a little cleaner, I duplicate this code a little bit. This is not dry code, but it will suffice. Chat input, I'll set back the value of this to be an empty string. And we need to get back the result. What does the AI answer to our question or to whatever we have to say? Well, for that, I say await, and we'll call the API, the chat that we've created, .send message. We are now actually sending the user message, and whatever we receive is going to be what the AI has to say as a response. So I'll just display the chat message as the model now, and we are displaying the result. But displaying the result would result in actually displaying a promise, which is not something you'd like. So as usual, result.response text is what we'll call. With this, our whole app should be working. Let's check if I made any errors. This is working so far. Let's check the console. No errors yet. Type in something like let's chat, because why not? I'll submit this, and we are awaiting the response. As you see, I'm happy to chat and etc. etc. The response comes back. Let's chat again. Let's ask, how are you? Of course, this is an AI. It's a language model. It won't answer us properly, but can you generate me an image in this chat, or is this API only for chatting? And it says that it's a text-based model, so it cannot generate us text in here. So it's not a fully functional Gemini, but it's a text-based Gemini that we've built over here just for chatting purposes. With this, we are pretty much done. I hope you enjoyed it and found value in it. If you did, please consider giving us a like and maybe even subscribe. This will help the algorithm reach out to more people. And other than that, I hope to see you in the next one. Happy coding and God bless.